Hi, folks.
Hello.
How's everyone doing
Fantastic.
on this rainy Tuesday morning?
Feels like Seattle.
Feels like Seattle. Some of you are moving to Seattle, right? Cool. So we're gonna continue from where we left off. So before we do that, I just wanted to review what we have done so far. So we've started working on our restaurant picker. We're using just React at this moment. We have divided our code base into a client folder, a server folder, and some common stuff. The client portion contains our front-end server, which is serving the React components. Our backend server contains the API, which talks to Yelp and gives us the restaurants back. So let's look at the server part. It's pretty simple. We just have a single route on our API, which is just Yelp search. That takes in some parameters about what kinds of parameters we want to search for. So we search for restaurant name, location, and a bunch of other things, and then we make a call to our Yelp API, and then we get back JSON. So that's just the one single route, and then we have this library here which actually does the heavy lifting of talking to Yelp, and essentially the search function here. And we're just exporting this function search right now. So that's like our back end. Our front end is also sort of simple. We start out with this index file. You may see some Redux code in here, but we're not really using it yet. All we're doing is we're rendering our app component. You can ignore this provider for now. And our components, our app component is the one that is doing all of the heavy lifting. This app component has some state, initial state about our app. And in the beginning, everything is set to the defaults, nothing has happened so far. So our rejected restaurant is an empty array. We're keeping track of which restaurant we have accepted. And in the beginning, it's -1, which means that we haven't seen anything yet. We're keeping track of the list of restaurants we get back from our search. And in the beginning, we haven't searched for anything, so it's empty. And then current restaurant index indicates which restaurant the user is at in our search. And that is also, it's a 0. Okay, so when this component, so we're using one of the React's API. What is this function called? It's like a lifecycle method. Thank you. We're using a lifecycle method component in mount, and what we're doing here is we're making a request to fetch some restaurants, and by default we're making a request to fetch restaurants in Oakland using our Yelp search API. Remember we looked at the backend route for our search. So we're literally making use of the same route. So we're going to localhost 3000, Yelp search, and then we're passing in the query string. Then we're getting back some response. We're parsing it as JSON. And then once we pass it as JSON, we are setting our state, and we are setting the key restaurants from search to whatever the JSON comes back. And the JSON is going to be the list of restaurants that Yelp returns. And that's going to change line 26. And this is now going to contain not an empty array anymore, but the actual restaurants that come back from our API. So that way, in our component, we will now have access to the restaurants that are that match that user search query. So once that happens, what we're doing is we are checking to see if a user has accepted any restaurant. So, and the way we do that is we check to see if the accepted restaurant index is greater than or equal to 0. And in the beginning, the index is -1. So this is going to be evaluated as false. So we're going to essentially go into our else if block. And then we're going to say, if the restaurants from search.length is greater than 0, that means we have some restaurants that we searched for. We are going to fetch the restaurants from search. We're going to pick one of the restaurants, and that restaurant is going to be the restaurant current index. So restaurant current index in the beginning is 0. So we're going to pick the first one, the first time around. We're going to pick the first restaurant that we get back from the search, and we're going to render our restaurant. And then we have our restaurant selects button component as well. And then we have two functions here, on restaurant reject and on restaurant accept. These functions are called when the select button is, or rather the accept button is clicked and the reject button is clicked. And what these functions do, we will look at in a second. So any questions so far?
When do you use component will mount instead of grid mount?
There is no such thing as component will mount. I think it's component will receive props.
No, there's a component.
Oh, really?
Will mount.
Okay, my bad. I don't know. Let's look it up. React component will mount.
I know when you're using component will mount, the only reason you don't want to do an AJAX request there is because whatever logic you have in here will run in the browser and it will run on your server. So you'll essentially be making the same AJAX request twice.
Oh, that's what you showed us.
It's invoked just before mounting occurs. Okay, but if there's nothing, if there's no component, then what happens to the data?
So here, so think about. So look at the description. It says it's invoked just before mounting occurs. It is called before render. Therefore, calling set state synchronously in this method will not trigger an extra re-rendering. So that means that when we change the state, that's not going to trigger a re-render of our component.
Okay.
Whereas we do, when in our case, we want to render a re-render because we're getting new restaurants from our search, and that's going to change the app component because we want to show that, oh, this is a new restaurant that's available to see. Whereas, so that's why it says avoid introducing any side effects or subscriptions in this method. For those cases, use component did mount instead. So component did mount, for example, is invoked immediately after a component is mounted. If you need to load data from a remote endpoint, this is a good place to instantiate the request. So calling set state in this method will trigger an extra rendering, but will happen before the browser updates the screen.
User won't see the intermediate state.
It's only if you're not doing anything asynchronous stuff. If you're doing like an asynchronous call to like Yelp's API, then React will still like render the component faster than the asynchronous call to Yelp will finish. Right. So we actually see that because if you notice that, oops, I was not in Adam. So we have an else here which says loading. So there's a loading component. So that component kind of like shows for a good like half a second because it takes half a second for Yelp to return the results. So was that your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else? Okay, so let's see this thing in action. So I would recommend everybody clone the component. The repo. And let's say npm run start client.
What's the script?
Start -client, okay. And this thing runs on localhost 8080, I think. Yeah. So let's start a new tab. Cool. So I don't know if you saw it, but it had a loading for half a second. So if we reject, we keep seeing new options until we see something we like. Yeah, wow.
So now what do we want to do?
Good question. So we wanted to introduce Redux.
Okay.
So it's like, given that we have like a working React app in some sense, how do we translate that and move that into a Redux application? So is everyone at this point where you're able to see this? If you clone the app?
Yeah. I clone the app. So.
Do you have a Yelp API key?
Yeah, but I didn't add it in. But
I think
can't use the same.
mine would probably work because mine is checked in, right? Because my Yelp API has the API key here. So technically it should work. What do you see in your console? Do you see any errors?
Oh, wait. Nope.
In your browser?
Oh, I didn't do the server console. I just did Redux.
Okay.
Thanks.
So maybe what we should... Okay, so let's create another file here. I'm going to call it to-do.md. Things to do in the future when Yelp API fails. We should show a message. Something like that. Okay. So how many of you here have had any experience with Redux? Okay.
Have a tutorial that I don't understand.
So if I were to ask you, so if I were to ask other folks about like the flow of data in Redux, would you be able to sort of grok it?
I struggled through
So
it.
do you want me to like go over that again?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's use the whiteboard. I don't know if anyone's on the call here. So how many of you can like tell me what is the flow of data in React? Can anyone tell me that? Yeah, you do.
You start with the initial state.
Mm-hmm. You want to draw it up here?
My handwriting is terrible. So, I'm left-handed. So I start with the constructor, where I have like this dot state, right, and it's some type of some type of object, and then this is used. This dot state actually is used in the UI, in the, I guess the component. And then the components, if you make an update to the component, then that impacts like a function that you have. Function.
And this is an event that triggers the function.
Exactly.
So there's an event that triggers an event there.
Okay. So an event. Yeah. So this could be a key press, like when you're entering something into a form or when you're clicking a button, and then that will trigger a function that calls set state. That updates the state here. And so goes roughly,
And that triggers a re-render.
and that triggers a re-render. Anytime you change the state, there's a what is it? There's a render. I'll apologize for my handwriting.
Oh, good. Okay. Cool. Any questions about this? Does this make sense to everybody? Agree? So this is great, right? Like, so now you sort of decouple your state from the UI in some sense. All you have to think about is what does my state look like, and when do I, or rather, whenever an event comes in, I only have to worry about changing my state. I don't have to worry about touching the UI at all. React automatically, like transparently, just updates the UI for us whenever state changes. That's the benefit of React. So you're only thinking of state. You have completely disassociated your state from the actual UI. About when this updates, what should I do? You're just worried about when should the state update, that's all. And React will do the rendering for you. Okay, so now, why do I want to use Redux though? This looks like a pretty cool model. Why do we want to get away from this?
I manage state for multiple components on your application.
So now here we haven't talked about where the state lives. And this state could live inside component A, and then I could have a component A render component B, and I could have a component B render component C, and then I could have some state inside component C, which exists. So now there's state in component A, there's state in component C. So it's very hard for me as a programmer to kind of wrap my head around what is the location of all these different pieces of state. They're just like locked in these components. And I have to individually go inside each of these components to get an idea of like, okay, these are the different sort of states in my app. And that kind of gets hard after a point when you have close to like 20 or 30 components just to like wrap your head around. So it would be nice if it was still this model, which is like all the state is in one place, and then something happens, some event happens, some change happens, and the state is changed. So the same model. But the difference would be all of the state would be in one place. Right now, this is sort of a simplified model in React because the state is not in one place. Each component has this life cycle of data. There could be like 20 of these in different components all over your app, and you wouldn't know which function is changing that piece of state. It's kind of harder to wrap your head around. But we ideally want the same picture. We want the same flow. We want like state to be somewhere that causes data to flow into my UI. The UI has a bunch of event functions, event handlers, that when the user clicks on stuff, events are triggered. That's going to cause some function to execute, and that's going to update my state. The model still remains the same. So what we're going to change is we're going to introduce a new idea called Redux. Which is explicitly separating out the state from React. Right now, state lives inside a React component. What we're going to say is that we're going to have this special kind of state, which is like the app state. So we're going to introduce new ideas. We're going to say app state. And this is essentially inside my Redux, on the Redux side. So this is app state. And this is all my components, which is React.
So is Flux and Redux the same thing?
They're similar. They're not the same thing. Flux is a different library.
Okay.
That was invented before Redux, but it solves the same problem.
Okay.
So this is all my this is my UI, right? All my JSX, which needs some props to render itself, right? So these are like JSX and they're templates in some sense. Right? Templates need some data to become something more concrete. Right now they're just like HTML with some holes in them, and you kind of have to provide data to fill those holes in. So where does the data for the holes come in? That's where Redux comes in. So like here, this plus this builds the UI. The actual, so this actually isn't the UI yet. This is more like potential UI. This is a potential UI, and this is actually the UI. And then here, there's going to be events that are going to trigger changes in the app state, which is again going to cause a re-render in the UI. Actually, there's not a direct connection here. Let's say there's a direct connection here. So all the app state gets sent down as props to my React components, which cause the templates to combine with the props, and you actually get a real HTML, and then building them all together builds the UI for us. And then the UI will trigger some events that is going to like change the Redux Store here.
Okay, so in the past, I would have to pass props from the parent to the child, but in this environment, the Redux Store is almost like the parent when it comes to data.
Exactly. So all the state lives inside the Redux Store.
Yeah.
And any component which wants to have access to this will just have to say, hey, give me there's a direct connection.
Can you scooch over? I can always.
I can sit down.
Yeah, thank you. So, okay. So we have the state stored in the store, and it still gets triggered. Like all of this still gets triggered on events, right? The cycle starts with an event, and then the store passes down props to the actual components, and then the components, and that. When does the re-render happen? That happens. So
that doesn't change. So
when
when do React components get re-rendered?
When state changes.
When state changes or new props are passed down. There's two ways.
Okay.
So in this case, there isn't any explicit state change happening. So we haven't come to that where React can continue to have their own state, but I'm just like dropping that idea right now. Just assume that all the state lives inside my app state, and all of the app state is passed down as props. Right, because apps, think of this as like, as you were saying, like this is the parent, and all of it is just sort of being passed down as props. That's the analogy. And because this thing is being passed down as props, that causes a re-render in our component because new props are passed down. So that constraint for React still lives. So React re-renders the component every time this local state changes or new props are passed down. Those are the two conditions when re-render happens. That still continues. And the event is going to change my state. That is going to trigger new props to be passed down. That's going to trigger a re-render. So that cycle keeps flowing. So user does some new stuff, changes the state, props is passed down, causes a re-render.
This is a two-way data flow as opposed to.
What do you mean by two-way?
Like previously, what I learned from React was like it's a one-way data flow, so data flows from the parent to the children. But in this environment, the child can now impact the store and send data to the store.
But it's still one way though.
But the events going up to the
yeah.
But yeah, the event never turns around and goes to the component. That goes to the.
There's only
it
one.
Never goes the opposite way.
Got it.
Right. There's only one place for the state.
Got it.
So there's only one. So data is always flowing from like this container of state to all the components. It's never flowing the other way around. Changes to this, you can change the state by saying, hey, so this is essentially an event, or what we will learn is called an action. So it's essentially an action saying, hey, I want you to change the state because this action has occurred. The user is saying, is asking to fetch new data or something. That's an action, fetch new data. That action is basically going to be the Redux Store is going to respond to that action and is going to do something, which may cause the state to change, or it may not cause the state to change. And then if something changes, then the same thing applies. that new stuff gets passed down and re-render happens. Only if something changes does the re-render happen. If nothing changes, then it's the same. Nothing has happened.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the action is an object with data and a type, right?
We will come to that.
Okay. Well, I was going to ask, what's a container then?
Got it. So we haven't introduced that idea yet.
Okay.
Everyone good with this so far?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to introduce two more ideas now. Now they're going to say that a component is essentially, they're going to be two kinds of components. So not all components have to be connected to the Redux Store. Do you agree with that?
Yep.
Because I may just have a component called, profile. Let's say we have a component called profile details. And then all it has is like a hole for like name and maybe a display picture or something, right? Oops, that's a bad place. Something like this, right? So if these two things are essentially props that can come from some higher level. So let's say we had actually maybe profile detail is a bad example.
We've got a button.
What's that?
A button doesn't necessarily need access to.
I want a component which
Has some data.
has some props. So what is it?
A form?
Form. Okay, so let's look at our the restaurant details page, right? In our app itself. So we have a restaurant, and then there's like same thing, I guess, name, and let's say this is the address here. So this is our this component doesn't necessarily need to be connected directly to the store. We can have some higher level component called app, which can be connected to the store, and then pass down props to restaurant here. So this is the one that is sort of directly connected to my store, my Redux store. Right, so this is the connection. But restaurant is not, the restaurant component is not directly connected to the store. It's connected via the app component. So it's almost like the parent is connected to the store and the child is not. And it's only getting the data that it needs as props from the parent.
So it's still being passed down.
Still being passed down.
Normal.
Yes, but the state lives in the store.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's still being passed on as props. So even from here, the state is being passed on as props. Everything gets passed on as props in Redux. There's no direct interaction with state, which lives in the Redux store. So the Redux store is also passing down its own state as props to the component that it's connected to. So app is connected to the Redux store directly. So app gets like data from the Redux store as props. Similarly, app may render some other components, and those of those components may need data. So this app will send down the data as props. So you're only working with props from the level of your components. Yeah.
What about in a form where an input line has to have?
We'll come to that.
Okay.
So there are some exceptions where a component can have its own state, just like the old React way. But we'll come to that. Let's not complicate things yet. But think of the simplified model as like Redux Store is got the state, and all the other components are getting props. There's no real state anywhere. That's a simplified model.
You can pick and choose which ones you want to be in the Redux Store, which ones you want to stay.
Right. So in this case, app is only connected to the Redux Store. Whereas restaurant, which is a child of app, isn't connected to the Redux Store directly. Right. So from the app's point of view, it really doesn't care where the data is coming from. It could, for all you know, it could have been like there was another like component outside of app which was passing down data as props. It's essentially the same thing. It just so happens that app is connected to the Redux Store, and the Redux Store is giving the props, giving the data down as props. Similarly, app is sending down props to restaurant. So in this case, there's two kinds of components, Bree. So coming back to your question, the app component is what is known as a container. Why? Because it's connected directly to the Redux Store. All components which are directly connected to the Redux Store are called containers. And that's just a name invented out of thin air to differentiate between these two kinds of components. Because then you can have separate folders and you can like visually see them differently, and it's more like documentation about this is a store which is connected to this is a component connected to a store, and these are components which are not connected to the store. So like a restaurant would continue to be just a regular component. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's just like, it doesn't really mean anything. It's just something invented out of thin air. So it's just a way to organize your components. To say that this is a component and this is a container. Sorry, this is a component and this is a container.
So components that manage their own state are just regular components? Or not directly connected?
So components which are not connected to the Redux Store are components. And components which are connected to the Redux Store are containers.
Okay.
Everything is a component. It's just like
Yeah.
a container is a special kind of component.
Yeah.
So how do I decide which component should be connected to the store?
That's a good question. That's up to you. That's the choice you're doing. You're making as programmers, and you'll get better at it once you just use it a bit more. And we'll try to maybe answer that when we're actually making a component. Okay, so we didn't speak about actions and so some of the internals of Redux. So there's, can I erase this?
Yeah.
Or would this be useful to have?
Only one picture.
Okay.
Also, I can share the slideshow that Latoya made because it's got some diagrams too.
Share everything you have, my friend.
So I'll make sure to repost that slideshow that she made.
Where?
I'll post it in general.
Thank you.
You can get it.
Okay. So okay, remember we spoke about events or actions updating the Redux Store. We spoke about that briefly. So, so there's essentially like a few concepts that we have to cover in Redux. So the first one is called an action. So action is just an object which contains a property called type, which is a string, and it contains the name of the action. So it could be like fetch like names or something. And this is an action to do something. That's it. It could just be as simple as this. But usually it has another property called payload or data, which contains some information on what to do. So let's say it was fetch profile was the action. So I want to fetch a profile, but then which profile do I want to fetch? I want to fetch a profile of a specific ID. So the payload could contain information about like ID is 10. So this is like metadata, not even metadata, it's actually data about what this action needs in order to be able to execute itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So something like, this could be another example of an action. This is like fetch all posts. So fetch all posts doesn't really need any data to fetch itself. Like it doesn't need any additional information. It's like, oh, give me all of them. So the function that actually goes and fetches this would just make a call to some sort of an endpoint, which just returns all the posts. But whereas here, when I want to fetch a specific profile of a user, I need to know which user I'm talking about. So there is a distinction between one which is self-contained, where it doesn't need any data to perform the action, whereas this one needs some data to perform the action. Does that make sense, Sabrina?
So if you're getting something specific, you would need it. If you're just getting all, it's not necessary.
Exactly. Or even if you're getting all, you may need You may need it. It just depends on the action. Some actions need some more data to perform. Like let's say I was saying create user. What do you think the data would be needed to create a user?
The username or password.
Exactly. So the payload will be the actual user. So like name, email, whatever you need for like the backend or wherever you're trying to like do this action, whatever data it needs. Does that make sense?
Is it typical for the payload to always be an object like in the first one?
No. It can just be whatever you want. Because there has to be some, so we'll come to how this action is like, what is the word I'm looking for? Respond, like taken care of? I don't know. So there is another function which will respond to this action, which needs to do something to this action, right? Because I'm saying the event is saying that, oh, this action has occurred. Now somebody has to do something about this action. So in the case of fetch profile, a request has to be made to fetch the profile. In the case of creating a user, you have to make a request to the backend to like actually create the user, or maybe even update the state locally or something, right? Something needs to happen. So there has to be some function which responds to these actions. But before we get to that, notice that these are plain objects, right? Yes, everyone seen that? But some of them have dynamic values, like ID 10. Does that make sense? Because this could be 10, this could also be 20, or this could be 25, right? This depends on which user we want to like fetch the profile for. So if it is dynamic, how do we create a dynamic object? No, not you. You know that. A variable?
You just put the square bracket.
Oh, with a function.
With the function, yeah. Right? Anything which is dynamic needs to, you don't know the value of it until it is called. So a function would be a way to create a dynamic object. Why? Does
Like
that
a method on the object itself?
No, just a regular function. I could call a function create action, which does something. Maybe it takes an ID. So what is the dynamic value in this one? Just the ID is the dynamic value. So all it needs to take is an argument called ID, and it just returns the object. It returns type, fetch, and then payload ID is ID. Right, so I'm using this ID to populate this value here. And when I call this function create action, with 20, I would get back this object. Everyone seeing that?
Okay, so oh, I see. Okay, I see. I return the object. Okay.
So for anything that usually actions are dynamic. It's very rare that you don't have an action with the payload. 90% of the time you have actions with payloads. So most of like so we need to create these actions, right? Whenever a button is clicked, we want to create this sort of object. So that object is essentially going to call out one of these functions. Is that, I mean, not that object, but that action, that event that gets triggered is going to call out to one of these functions, and which is going to in turn create an object, which will create this dynamic contents of the object. Make sense? So we created this. We introduced this word called action. We're going to introduce another word called action creator. What is an action creator? No, it's literally this function. It's a function which just creates actions. Because actions are dynamic objects. And the only way to create dynamic objects is using a function. So we need functions to create actions. So action creator is nothing but just a function which creates an action. That's literally what it is. So this is an example of an action creator.
Action creator goes inside the payload. Or creates the payload.
Action creator creates this whole object. It creates the action, which is literally what the word action creator is. Like it creates action. So this would be a function called fetch profile, for example. This will be the action creator for the fetch profile action. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So now an action creator will create an action, and this action is sent down to, we will introduce another word called a reducer.
It's sent down one.
It's sent to what is known as a reducer. So reducer is something that responds to actions. Okay. Why is that cool? What does a reduce function do?
It reduces things down to one.
Right, it takes something and like takes. It could actually keep it exactly the same too. So, but typically we have seen reduced to like some lists and so. Can I erase this? This is good. Everyone followed with this part?
Wait a
Can you send that?
Yeah. Okay.
Sure.
I'll put it on.
So I'm just going to keep like the names of things you've seen so far. Okay. So what does the reduce do? Everyone know this function? Yeah?
Better return.
The reduce function. What does it do? What does it return? Roger, what does it return?
No idea.
Think about it. What does it reduce?
Is it gonna add? I just don't know what A's and num are.
It's just a name of a variable,
Oh.
ACC, usually referred to as an accumulator.
Okay. So just adds the number to the previous one or something like that?
Yeah. So it's returning, in this case, it's just like summing up the list.
Okay.
So like 1 plus 2 plus 3. So the initial value of ACC would be 1, and then the initial value of num would be 2. So it's going to add 1 plus 2. And the new value gets returned and is bound to the ACC again. So 1 plus 2 is bound to 3 on the next iteration. So 3, and then the next number will be 3. 3 plus 3. So we return 3, and then we're done with the list, and that will be the final result. 6 is the final result. But notice that this is our reduce function, which takes in the previous value of the state, it takes in some extra value, and returns the new value of the state. So I want to change ACC to state. It's essentially saying that this is my current state, and this is my new thing that has happened, new thing coming in, and I'm taking my old state and I'm adding this new thing that is happening, which will modify my state. So let's get rid of this reduce here and just like focus on this function. Right? So this function is essentially saying I get some piece of state, and I have an existing state, I get a new input, like something new comes into my function. And then I take this new thing and I combine it with my old state to get the new value of the state. And this is called a reduce function. This is the function that is passed into my reduce. My reducing function, actually. Does that make sense? Because we use this function to pass to our map.reduce, to our array.reduce. So this is known as a reducing function. Okay, so now I'm going to write something. So reducing function for not Haskell, for Redux is it takes in some state, takes in an action, right? What does an action have?
Data and a type.
Right, it has payload or data and a type, which is an object, and state is also an object, and it does something to the state using the action. So in here we were doing plus because it's very specific that we were adding to a list, but this is something like plus with like some operation of combine. It's actually more like a combine. So let's call it like combine the state with action, which returns a new state. So the combine function takes a state and takes not an action. No. So it takes a state and takes a num and returns the new state. Remember, it was the new state was being passed to the next iteration. So if we had a list of 1, 2, 3, initially 1 and 2 would be used. We would combine 1 and 2, and then the new value would be used to do the next value. So similarly, you can think of Redux as a list, as an array of actions. Actions are coming in continuously into your app, and then one action is picked. The current state is taken, they combine, and then a new action comes in. New action is combined with the old state and returns a new state, and the new state is combined with the next action coming in. So it's literally reducing over the list of actions. You see the analogy there? In this case, I had a list of numbers. In this case, I had 1, 2, 3. But in this case, I may have a list of type is fetch from some data, and then I could have a type called fetch posts. Create post with some payload. So these are my lists of actions. And I want to reduce over these actions and give you a new state. So my reducing function takes an existing state, takes an action, and then returns the new state after that action has been performed. It's kind of similar to my reducing function for my plus, which was takes the initial state. So I don't know if you remember, reduce takes, so if I were to call 1.3 dot, okay, let's say that 4.5 dot reduce, I can pass in the initial value of my accumulator here as an argument. Does everyone know that? In my reduce, I can pass in an argument which specifies my initial value of my state. So that's my state, and then I'm just going to say return state plus num. So in the beginning, it's going to be 0, and then num is going to be 1 in the first iteration. And then 1 is going to be added to state, so 1 plus 0 is going to be 1, and then that's going to be the new value of my state with this new num coming in. So if I replace num with action here, I'm essentially saying that these are my actions. Each of these is an action, and I'm taking an action that's coming in, and I'm combining it with my state, and I'm returning the new value of the state.
So it's always like incrementing, like you're just adding a new.
In this case. So you can think of the adding function as like some sort of a combination operation, which will just return a new state. So let's say my reduce function was I want to compute the sum of squares. What is this reducing function for sum of squares? What's that? I wanted to do 1 square plus 2 square plus 3 square plus 4 square. If it was my reduce. So right now I'm just doing a regular plus. Right? If I wanted to like do the square of each of the numbers, what would I have to do?
State plus action squared.
Right, it would just be state plus action squared. Action times action. Because then each of them would be multiplied by itself and then added to the previous state. Is that making sense? No?
Because it's one times 2, 2 times 2, 3 times 2.
Right. But notice that it's being added to the previous value of the state. So in the first iteration, this is the new value of the state. The second iteration, this is the new value of the state. The third iteration, this is the new value of the state. It's just that the new number which is coming in is bound to the action. And then I'm doing something with the action, and then that action is combining it with the state somehow. In this case, I just happen to be adding it. But I can do anything. So in this case, my state would be some sort of an object, would be my initial value. And an empty object would be my initial value. And then my action would be an object. And then I would look at my action. And then in case of like fetch, let's say it was fetch posts, I would want to make some call to some API to fetch all my posts, which would return a list of posts. And then I would return the new value of my state, which could be like posts is some sort of a list. This could be my new value of posts, or new value of my state after I complete my action. Maybe this is like kind of a little hard to wrap your head around, but this will make sense once we actually start writing some code. But so far, just remember this, that a reducer is nothing but a reducing function for actions. That's all you have to remember. Just like how this function is a reducing function for summing up an array of numbers. This is the reducing function. The analogy is the same, where you have an array of numbers here. Here you may have an array of actions, because actions are coming in one after the other. Right? The user is clicking a button, clicking a button, clicking a button. So you're essentially building up a list of actions. And then each of them is being processed one at a time. So you process an action that gives you back a new state. Then another action comes in, that gets processed, and that returns a new state. Another action comes in, that gets processed, and that returns a new state. So this is happening continuously, one after the other. And then finally, we get back a new state. So let's like write some code, because all of this was very wishy-washy in your head. Yeah, you have that.
Just make one. I think what might be a little confusing about the analogy is that reduce function, you plug in an array or whatever, and you get a result at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with Redux, it's just you're getting a result every time you iterate.
Every render?
Yeah, right. Like the state is changing every time, so you're getting a return.
But it's changing only every time an action is triggered.
Right.
Every time a new action comes in, this function is called.
Yeah.
Which gives you back the new state.
Right.
Whereas in this case, it just happens all at once. That's the difference?
Yeah, that's what I'm kind of thinking.
But let's imagine that this was like
slow it down.
Yeah, let's imagine it was like some sort of a function which is accepting numbers one at a time.
Yeah.
Right? It's like one comes in, and then it's like the state so far is 1.
Yeah.
And then another one, 2 comes in. So yeah, if you slow it down, exactly. And it never ends, because in the future it may be like the user may send in another number. So it's almost like it's waiting for a number to come in. That's the analogy. So here also you're waiting for actions to come in. So the user may not never click your app, or they may keep clicking your app. Cool. With that said, let's write some code. Okay, so we introduced some ideas called action, action creator, and reducers. So if you look at our directory structure, we already have a folder called actions. And we already have a folder called reducers. And Redux has some interesting functions that like do some work for us, like combine reducers, for example. We'll go through what each of those things mean. But you'll know, but whatever this, so the root reducer is kind of like the root component. This is where like Redux will start building our state from. So if we go into our app, we're essentially calling our root reducer here somewhere. Or actually, it should be in our index. Yeah. So we're calling reducers. We're importing reducers from reducers. And reducers is exporting the root reducer. Right? So we're importing our we're importing the reducer, and then we're providing the reducer as an argument to the create store with middleware. And that essentially returns the store. And that store is going to contain the state that is returned by this reducer. So what is the initial state of our reducer? It is just an empty object right now. And a reducer essentially, remember I said that a reducer takes a reducing function? So in this case, the reducing function is doing nothing. It's just taking a state as an argument and returning the same state back. So whenever this function is called, it always keeps returning the same state. So we will, this may not make sense, but it'll make sense when it gets a little bit more interesting. So if we go to our browser and we open our React console, so we'll notice that there is a store in here. Get state is a function. How do we actually see the store contents? I guess that's in Redux, right?
Yeah, but then you'll need to add like that
Oh,
line of code, like window.
Right. Oh, this is already. You're using the extension, right?
Yeah. Yeah. If you already have it installed, you just, that line of code right there.
Oh,
Yes, that green one. That's what you need. There you go.
So I'll just paste this in the Slack channel too. Actually, I can just paste the piece of code in here. So let's see.
No, no, it's there. Just took a second.
Okay. Cool. So nothing really happened. How do I see my store?
You can click over to state in the it's got like action, state, diff,
All right.
test. So that will
Okay, cool. This is my initial state. It's empty value. And that's because in my store, plant reducers, I have this as an empty value. But let's say this was posts is empty. I could actually like completely change this and say posts is a function which takes in posts and return posts. So if I change this, I'll see that I have posts as an empty array. So essentially here, this is what is the reducer. So reducing function, so let's say I wanted to extract this out and call it like posts reducer. I would say this is nothing but a function which takes in the old state, takes in an action, and it returns the new state. Right now it just could be the same thing, which I could return posts. And then this I would just replace with posts reducer. So in my root reducer, combined reducer function, it essentially takes an object where each key is the properties that I expect in my state, and the values are the reducing functions. And reducing functions are essentially functions which take in 2 arguments, just like the reducing function we saw with adding an array of numbers. It takes in an accumulator, which is essentially the old state, and it takes a new action. And then the action does something and it updates the state. And it essentially returns a new state. So in the case of like, so we have to essentially respond to this action. So let's say we had ways of like fetching posts, right? So let's say there was a fetch post was, let's say we had this action called fetch post. So remember what is, so this is like a pop quiz here. So what is action going to be?
That's what you add into the previous.
Right, but then what does an action look like?
It's an object.
It's an object, and what are the keys on the object? Has a type, and it has a data or payload, right? So what we usually do is we switch. What does a switch statement do? Kind of like an if statement.
If this is that, then do this.
Right, so we switch on the action dot type because we want to respond only to certain kinds of actions. Like for example, let's say if there was an action called fetch profile, which fetches profile. Our post reducer really doesn't care about that action. It only cares about actions which do some posty things, which is like fetching a post, like deleting a post, creating a post, etc., etc. So we essentially switch on. We say case fetch profile. So another reason why I created these cons is because whenever I'm using these strings more than once, I don't want to repeat myself, and I just want to like have a single declaration of my action, and then I can use that declaration everywhere else. So let's say I decide to change my action to be like, go and fetch my profile. Like I can change the string, but then my my reference doesn't change. So that way I don't have to like keep fixing it every time things change. Okay, so in my switch statement, I'm going to essentially switch on my action type, and then based on my action type, I want to do some stuff. So when I, let's say, fetch profile, I want to like maybe do a fetch request, right? And I may want to like go and like get my posts, and then blah blah blah, something happens, and then I get my post back. But instead, let me just like return ID is one. What is it? Title is. Let's say this were all the posts. So what's happening here? What is this? What are we returning? Oh, this is not profile. This is actually posts. Or fetch post.
Array.
So we're returning an array. Why are we returning an array?
Give it to the UI.
Right. So we're essentially simulating an action that a fetch posts action has occurred, and that's going to return the posts that get fetched from someplace. But I don't really want to make a request to fetch posts because I don't really have that. So I'm just simulating that I get back an array of posts. But the posts reducer is essentially only for this key here, which is the posts key. So whatever post reducer returns is going to be replaced with whatever is highlighted on the page, which is this post reducer. So I expect the post reducer function to just give me back the posts at all times, no matter what. The post reducer is always called, and it always expects, it always needs to return back the posts, because that's what my state is mapping to. My key's posts represents my posts in my state. So in the case of fetch posts, I essentially am returning some posts. So this is going to be now the value of my posts in my state whenever a fetch post action is occurred. But in the case of, what about in the case of fetch profile? What do I want to do? Return an empty array? But what if my posts were something or not empty? So I essentially want to ignore this action, right? I just don't know. I don't want to do anything. But what is ignoring in Redux? So I want to return the old value, right? The old value, because I just want to ignore. Nothing. This is not an
state didn't change.
right. This is not an action that I have to worry about. This is not an action that this reducer has to care about. Some other reducer will care about this action. So when I want to and this reducer is only caring about the post. That's what it's maintaining. So what is the old value of this post reducer? The old state.
State to equal state, or the.
So remember I mentioned the reducing function takes two arguments. It takes the old value of the state and the action, and it returns the new value of the state. Right? But sometimes the new value of the state can equal to the old value of the state when an action is essentially ignored. Like when you want to ignore an action, the old value of the state is exactly the same as the new value of the state. That's essentially like saying, this action didn't really do anything. It was a no-op in some sense. It was a no operation. So return posts. Yeah, exactly. You just return the posts. Because posts is the old value of my state. So this post equal to empty array is essentially saying that is the value of posts if post was ever null or undefined. So in the beginning. So that we are never returning undefined. It's always like an actual array. But then we don't want to do this for each and every action, right? Because there may be like hundreds of actions, and then we have to like respond to each of them. So usually with the case, what we say is we just say is default. The default is return post. That means for all the posts all the actions that we don't care about, we just return the old value. So this is literally the old value. This is literally a reducing function, people. I don't know if you're seeing this. This is mind-blowing when I realized this. That this is just like a reducer. This is why the name is called a reducer, because it's a reducing function. It takes the old value and it takes a new action, and then it's like does something to the state to return the new value of the state. Kind of like an accumulator and a number that adds and it returns the new value of the accumulator. That's literally the analogy.
And I'm sorry, I'm trying to take notes and follow along. So
Yeah.
I'm missing some of your lecture.
Okay.
That's why I hate doing things while you're lecturing. But so you're saying that that we're just going to return the old post if we don't want the state to change, right? If we don't want to change the state.
Mm-hmm.
And why wouldn't we want to change the state again? I forgot what was the case.
So in the case of fetch profile,
Uh-huh.
that isn't something that concerns posts reducer, right? Because this is only taking care of this
Oh, okay.
key. So let's say we had another thing called profile here, and we had a profile reducer. Let's say we haven't defined it yet, but we can. So profile. So what would profile reducer be? Like just the most silliest profile reducer ever, which just returns an empty object as a state. What would that look like? So all reducing functions. What are the properties of a reducing function? Okay, so let's explicitly write it down.
State interaction.
Right. So properties of a reducing function. Takes two arguments. Old state is action. Those are all the properties. Returns new state. Returns new state. Sometimes new state can be the same as old state when we want to ignore the action. This is all a reducing function is.
So we in our reducers.index we have a root reducer, and that's going to contain all of the reducers that we built for our application,
Mm-hmm.
and then we'll write functions for each of those
Right.
that will reduce. Okay.
So the intention is we want to split our entire app state into smaller chunks. We want to split it just for like posts. We want to split it for profile. We may have like restaurants. We may have a restaurants reducer, etc., etc. And this is because we can just sort of like make our code more modular and into more like smaller chunks. That way, a reducing function doesn't have to manage the entire state. It can only return like the piece that it cares about. Which is why like the post reducer only returns the post. The profile reducer only returns the profile. The restaurant reducer only returns the restaurants. It doesn't like care about the others. So our functions become a lot more like modular, exactly. And single responsibility principle, for example.
What if one event changes the state of many components?
That's completely fine too. So each of the actions would have to be would have a case statement in each of the functions. So let's look at something like that. Let's say so let's go back here. So what does the profile reducer look like? So it takes a profile and it takes an action. And it's always good to specify the initial value of the profile. So what is if it's undefined? So we have to figure out like what is our profile. So most likely profile is an object, right? Because it has like a name and email and stuff. Okay, so the simplest, let's say the profile reducer doesn't really do anything yet. What would it return every time an action occurs? It returns the profile, yeah. This is like the simplest reducer function that you can have, which doesn't do anything. It just ignores any action, right? Because it's not really taking into consideration the action at all. It's always returning the same profile over and over and over again.
Because there's nothing to add. That's why.
Or we just chose to do this way because we haven't like thought about what are the different
Yeah.
actions that can occur. But this would be the simplest thing. Like when you were to like combine your profile with your reducer, you need to give the this combined reducer is an actual reducer function. So the simplest function that you can think of is just something that just returns whatever it gives it in. So the old state is always being returned. So it's never creating any like new state which is different from your old state. So in essence, it's ignoring all the actions.
So it's pointless.
It's pointless, exactly. But at least we get a key called profile in our state. So if we refresh and we only had posts, actually this may not work because we don't have restaurants reducer.
You also, there's a typo in post reducers where you had like returns posts.
Oh, thank you. So we actually don't need this anymore. No. Post reducer is not found. Oh, I need to define it above it.
No, it's because it says post.
Profile reducer. Oh, I think that's right. I didn't define it as a constant. Okay, so what will that state look like? Guesses?
Profile that's an empty object.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Posts that is the ID of one in it. Or right with the one.
Why would it have an ID with one in it?
Never mind.
I thought it says return in the outcome, return ID and title below.
Right, but that's
Doing that action.
only when that action is triggered. Right, only when fetch post action is triggered does that happen. So technically, it should be an empty array. But we can simulate. Can you simulate actions here?
I don't know. Maybe you could go to the action tab and see.
Dispatcher. Aha. See, we're going to simulate an action now and watch our state change like magic. Fetch posts. Hoo-ha.
These dev tools are really nice.
What's that?
I said the dev tools are really nice.
Yeah, so cool. So we literally just triggered a random action here and just we see like, oh, what happened? Our post changed. Let's try to do fetch profile. What do you think is going to happen?
The profile is going to show up.
No, yeah, I mean, nothing's going to happen because we haven't implemented it.
Yeah.
Right? We haven't, nothing is responding to the action fetch profile. So which one do we want to, which reducer would respond to the fetch profile action? Profile reducer, because that's the one that is connected to this key here. So you have to think of like, which key am I changing? Whenever an action is occurring. And that those, so was that your question, Sabrina? Like if there's two things that you want to change? So let's say we want to change, what is a good example of this? Let's say we had, for whatever reasons, we had username is username reducer, and we had a profile reducer as well, for whatever reasons. Terrible idea to do, but we're going to do it for simulation purposes.
Or say like a user chooses a restaurant, right? And the whole damn screen changes. Like the state of like restaurants being chosen changes, and like maybe we have something called like picks, driving directions or something like that. And that has to change at the same time that the choices. Yeah,
Sure.
I want this restaurant.
Sure. So essentially, you're going to have action called like, change select restaurant or something, right? So if that was the case, let's say for whatever reasons our post reducer was changing, you would handle that case and say case select restaurant, and you would return the new state based on that action. So something would be returned here. And then in my profile reducer also, I would respond to it because all actions are sent to all reducers.
All actions are sent to all reducers.
Yes.
Oh.
So every reducer can just either ignore the action because it doesn't care about it, or it can respond to it.
I thought only targeted.
So all actions are sent to all reducers because the reducer doesn't really know what to do, right? It's like some action has occurred. Do I need to care about this action or do I ignore it?
And that's why you need to default state in all of your reducers.
Exactly. So if you want to ignore your action, you just return the old state.
My mind is literally blown.
Nice.
Like I knew you said it once, and I was just like, okay, sure, but I get it now.
Cool.
So every reducer will receive every action and either responds to it or not, basically, right? Oh, that's what that is. It's like all the reducers.
So for example, like my profile reducer, when I select restaurant, could return like, I don't know, something weird.
Yeah. Else it returns like a default, right? Like else the state doesn't change. Like,
Right. So like, for example, let's do something crazy. So let's like say state.concat. So whenever a select restaurant action occurs, we're going to update our posts and we're going to add a new post with weird true, whatever thing, and we're going to change our profile reducer profile to be weird true 2 or something.
The post. Yeah.
All right, thank you. So let's try that. So we're going to explicitly trigger. Oh no. Oh yeah, username reducer.
So you had to take off the reducer.
Yeah, because it wasn't defined. It needs an actual function. Okay, so here I'm going to say select restaurant. I'm going to dispatch this. I notice that both these things changed. Did you see that? Debrina, this is your question. We are simulating the thing where I have an action called select restaurant, and that's going to be handled by both the reducers. So notice that both the post is empty object and profile is empty object.
Yeah.
So I'm going to do a dispatch now, and that's going to change my posts as well as profile.
I got it now.
Because
Yeah, they both change because all the state flows through all the reducers.
all actions flow through all of
All actions flow through all the reducers and it either changes the state or not.
Mhm.
I got it. So now I'm confused about another thing.
Sure. What's the confusion?
So like, I see what we're doing here with the reducers. But then how does that reflect? Like, how does that affect the store afterward?
What do you mean? This is the store.
That's what I wanted to answer. So the reducers are the store?
They are the state.
They are
And the
the
store
state
is
of
the
the-
one that is holding the state. So if you look at our index, we're essentially saying create store with middleware, and we're passing the list of reducers.
And how do we see the components connected to the reducers?
Oh, we haven't come to that yet.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Sorry.
You have 2 indexes.
No, this is outside.
Oh.
This is the index of the whole app, of the client. Okay, we did a lot. So let's refresh. Who wants to do a refresher on what we did so far?
Come on, Celeste. Okay. The director called Celeste. I'm sorry. You're like, what? Sorry.
So we went over the cycles of both React
Okay.
and Redux.
Mm-hmm.
And then we said the reason we use Redux is because if you have React, you would have to go into every individual component file to find what you need, and that's too much of a headache. So basically, Redux is like the store that contains everything.
Specifically, just the state, yeah.
Yeah.
And in the first part, all the state is like hidden inside these different components, so it gets hard to like wrap your head around the entire state of your app.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, go on.
And then Redux is like the Papa kind of thing, where all state comes from Redux, and it's passed into React the way the parent-child flow would be.
Mm-hmm.
So Redux is like the parent, and then it passes it down. It passes prompts down to
Mm-hmm.
React.
Mm-hmm. To the React components.
To the React components. And then does anyone else want to take the baton from here?
So I think that UI events or action that trigger state changes in the store or the reducers, because those are the same thing, right? The store and the reducers are the same thing.
So reducers are things that respond to action.
Right.
And they update and they return the new state.
They return or pass props down to the React components, and then in the re-render, right? Or then that triggers.
Yeah. So the store is connected to the component. The reducers is just a small part of the store. Store is like this mega thing that has some other stuff, and part of it is a reducer. So, so reducer is just like the thing that manages the state, right? Like what happens when an action occurs and what is the new value of the state returned. So this is what a reducer looks like. This is the final reducer. It's called the root reducer, which is a combining like multiple reducers and putting into one. Now this reducing thing is now sent across to the store to say, here, this is going to be your set of functions that is going to handle all of the actions. And that's happening here. Oops. So when you say create store with middleware, it's taking a bunch of taking these reducers, which is like this combination of reducers.
You said the reducer is a small part of the store, and then you said the reducer passes it into the store. Is that how you said it?
So I said this reducers, since we have more than one reducer, we're using this function called combined reducers, which creates this mega reducer, which has like multiple reducers inside of it, right? It's like a transformer. And then that mega reducer is sent down to this create store with middleware function. The store is like this bigger thing, which a small part of it is like a reducer, the mega reducer. It has other things, like it has an ability to connect to components. It has an ability to like convert like the state into props, all these other features, right? And reducers is just a small portion of that. It has the ability to have an action sent to it, and then that's the one that dispatches all the actions to all the users. Like the store is the one managing all of that.
Is that just
so this is the store, yeah.
In the provider store?
So this thing, this is happening inline. This is literally the store. So what I could have also done is I can say, their store is this, and then just pass in. All right. So I've created the store here. So that is happening inline. So that's like, there wasn't any like real like concrete store. This is like in the air. But now you've sort of concretized it and saying that this is the variable which contains the store. Now I can pass this down to my provider. So this store makes use of our reducers that we just wrote. and that's a small piece of it. So the store has some other stuff as well, which which we haven't spoken about yet. Does that make sense? So reducers is not the only thing about the store. Reducers is just being passed down as arguments to this create store function. And the store has this other thing called middlewares and things that we will get to later. Yeah. Okay, then what about action creators and reducers? What's that about? Who wants to talk about that?
The action creator is the one that creates actions.
Okay, and what's an action?
It's an object.
Okay. What are there any properties of an action?
Dynamic.
Is data
They could be dynamic.
They could be data.
So have a property called type. Could have optional data stored in payload or data property. So why do we need a action creator? Because the data is dynamic. And if we have a static object, then we could never have dynamic values. So all of the dynamic values are passed in as arguments to the function. And then that creates the new object. So what would an action creator for fetch profile look like? Okay, so actually before that, let's write, properties of action creators. They are functions. What else?
They return an object.
They return an object. They accept
Like an
optional arguments
or
or dynamic values of the action. Yeah?
Yeah.
So what would a function like fetch profile look like?
we take like an ID
Takes an ID,
and it's going to return an object,
turns an object.
and the object is going to have like a payload.
So this returns an action actually.
Oh.
So it returns an action, and then you have to look at like, oh, what are the properties of an action?
Yeah.
So that's sort of like
it's creating that. It's creating that action. So it returns a action with an action object with a type and data, right? A type or payload.
So the type would be like fetch profile.
And then you'll have like another property with that maybe an object that has the actual data on it.
So you just say ID.
Is it convention that the type is always capital with underscores?
Yeah. Cool.
Hey, can I see the file that shows you the store in the render dump and the react dom.render? Yeah, that one. Okay, thank you.
Cool. I think that was it for today. This is a good place to stop. Good job. This was a lot. So yeah, so like, keep thinking about it. Try to like write some actions on your own, write some action creator functions, write some reducer functions. Now everyone knows what a reducer function is, right? Everyone knows what an action creator is. Everyone knows what an action is. So these ideas are essentially the three basic concepts of Redux. If you grok these three, you essentially know Redux. That's all that Redux is.
User function, actions,
Action creators.
action creator.
Oh, you said that?
User functions,
An action creator. I have a question, Puneet.
Mm-hmm.
When you